A lot of people have ex-boyfriend or girlfriend stories, but mine is different. Mine wasn't a romantic partner, it was a friend. For privacy's sake, I'll call him Brian. We met during my junior year of high school through a mutual friend, Holly, and quickly became close. Even though we went to different schools, Brian lived about a half hour away. We hung out almost every weekend. We'd grab food, drive around aimlessly, and talk for hours. Sometimes we'd go to concerts or parties together. For a long time, I considered him my best friend. But Brian was different. At first, I brushed off the quirks. He'd text me incessantly, sometimes sending 6 or 7 messages in a row if I didn't respond quickly. I chalked it up to him having a lot going on in his life, or so I thought. One night, Holly and I were chatting when she said something that made my stomach drop. She mentioned that Brian might have been lying about some serious things. For instance, he had told both of us that his sister had cancer. But when Holly brought it up during a hangout, his story didn't add up. Curious and uneasy, we decided to check out his mom's Facebook. I had recently added her as a friend, and she posted everything online. Yet, there was no mention of his sister being sick. Something that significant would have been there, right? I had never met his sister, but I hadn't thought much of it at the time. After all, we never hung out at his house, and I wasn't keen on having people over at mine either. But as Holly and I shared more stories, the pieces started falling into place. He had once claimed he might have cancer or that he was in the hospital for something life-threatening, only to be completely fine hours later. It was unsettling to realize how many lies he had told us. I felt betrayed. Someone I trusted, someone I called my best friend, had lied about such serious things. Holly and I agreed to confront him and then distance ourselves. I wanted to talk face to face, but Holly texted him first. That's when everything spiraled. The flood of messages began with him claiming he had just had a seizure. After everything I'd uncovered, I couldn't believe him. While I was at work, he called me incessantly, leaving my phone buzzing nonstop. Overwhelmed, I called Holly to see if she was experiencing the same thing. She was. His behavior had become so erratic that she ended up blocking his number. I didn't want to ghost him outright, but his actions were becoming disturbing. I finally texted him, saying I couldn't be friends with someone who lied about such sensitive things. I muted his notifications, hoping that would be the end of it. But it wasn't. A few days later, my dad called me, his voice laced with worry. He asked if I was okay. Confused, I assured him I was fine and asked why he was so concerned. That's when he told me Brian had called him, claiming something terrible had happened to me. My stomach twisted. How had Brian even gotten my dad's number? Not long after, my brother came to me, showing me messages Brian had sent him on Instagram. They were alarming. He said he would hurt himself if I didn't respond to him. Brian also contacted one of my best friends, saying the same thing. What made it unbearable was that he threatened to take his life in the same way my oldest brother had. It was a cruel, calculated way to hurt me. That was the breaking point. I sent him one final message, pouring out all my frustration and anger. Then I blocked him everywhere. For months, I thought it was over. But then, one day at work, he walked through the front doors. My department was in the back, giving me a clear view of the entrance. The sight of him made my blood run cold. I slipped into the back room and told my manager that if anyone asked for me, they should say I no longer worked there. Sure enough, he asked. I had to be escorted out by a coworker for the rest of the week, just in case he was lurking in the parking lot. About a month later, his car was parked on the street near my house when I came home from work. I was alone. Panicking, I drove to a friend's house and stayed there for hours. I didn't think he would hurt me, but the truth was, I didn't really know who he was anymore. That was the scariest part. After that, I called his mother. I told her everything, the stalking, the calls, the lies. I begged her to ensure he wouldn't come near me again. I didn't want to involve the police, but I was terrified. I loved his family, which made the situation all the more heartbreaking. To this day, Brian occasionally resurfaces. He creates fake accounts to contact me, or he'll send follow requests on social media. It happens once or twice a year, just enough to remind me he's still out there. I know he's not mentally well, and I truly hope he heals. but I also know I need to protect myself. If there's one thing I've learned, it's that friendships can be just as toxic as any romantic relationship. When someone shows you their true colors, believe them. Don't make excuses. Prioritize your mental health and your safety. Being a relatively young and shy person, I started using dating apps to help me meet people and hopefully find a lasting relationship. Social settings, especially with strangers, often made me anxious, so apps like Tinder felt like a safe way to ease into conversations. For reference, I'm a female in my early 20s, and at the time I had been using Tinder for just over a year. Most of my experiences were fine. Some turned into short-term relationships, while others simply became friendships. All my breakups had been mutual, with no hard feelings. This story began a few months after my last relationship. I matched with a guy named Peter and we started talking. Over 2 weeks of texting, he seemed like a nice, somewhat reserved person. I found his shyness endearing since I was shy too. Eventually, Peter asked me out on a date, and I agreed to meet him at a local restaurant. When I met him in person, nothing seemed off at first. One of my biggest fears with dating apps was that someone might look nothing like their photos, but Peter looked exactly as he had in his profile. He was soft-spoken, just like in our texts. However, our dinner conversation was awkward. Peter barely spoke and often looked around, avoiding eye contact. I tried to keep the conversation going, but his one-word answers made it difficult. At one point, he excused himself, saying he'd forgotten something in his car. He disappeared for nearly 15 minutes, leaving me alone at the table. When he returned, his demeanor was the same, quiet and distant. By the end of dinner, I kindly told him I didn't feel a connection and didn't want to pursue anything further. He stood there silently, nodded, and walked to his car without saying a word. I felt bad for rejecting him, but convinced myself it was the right thing to do. Later that evening, as I settled on the couch and turned on a movie, I heard soft footsteps approaching my front door. It was nearly 11 p.m., and the sound made me freeze. Muting the TV, I turned toward the door, straining to listen. 30 seconds passed in tense silence before a loud knock shattered the stillness. I jumped, my heart racing, and cautiously approached the door. Peering through the peephole, I was stunned to see Peter standing there. I cracked the door open just enough to stick my head out. What are you doing here, Peter?" He glanced at me briefly before looking around, as if checking his surroundings. His behavior unsettled me. Without waiting for a response, I shut the door and locked it. A few moments later, I heard footsteps retreating to the driveway, followed by the sound of a car starting and leaving. It wasn't until I sat back down that the full weight of the situation hit me. I had never given Peter my address. A cold wave of fear washed over me. How had he found my house? While I didn't feel immediately threatened, a growing unease settled in my chest. I double-checked the locks and went to bed, trying to push the incident out of my mind. The next morning, I made coffee and tried to shake off the eerie encounter. It had snowed overnight, and as I brought the trash out to the curb, I noticed something that made my blood run cold. Footprints. The tracks circled my house, stopping at windows and leading to the gate of my backyard. My mind raced. Peter had only walked to the front door last night, or so I thought. These footprints had to have been made while I was asleep. Standing in my living room, I felt a deep unease creeping in. My social anxiety made me hesitate to call 911, but the growing panic overtook me. I picked up my phone and dialed the police, explaining everything to the dispatcher. As I waited for the officers to arrive, I stood frozen in my living room, trying to steady my breathing. Then I heard it. Footsteps in the snow, just outside the living room window. My heart pounded in my chest as I stared at the window. The footsteps stopped, and a new sound sent a jolt of terror through me. A faint scraping noise. It was as if someone was trying to pry open the window. I screamed, unable to contain my fear. The sound of footsteps shifted to the side of the house, followed by a loud crash as the gate to my backyard swung open. Grabbing the first knife I saw in the kitchen, I bolted upstairs. Turning the corner, I glanced out the glass back door and saw him Peter, trying to force his way inside. Locking myself in the bathroom, I clutched the knife and sobbed, listening to the relentless banging and scraping at the back door. The sound was feral, like an animal trying to claw its way in. Minutes felt like hours as I imagined the horrible things he might do if he got inside. Suddenly, a knock at the front door interrupted the chaos. A police officer's voice called out, and the banging at the back door stopped abruptly. I ran to the front door, letting the officer in. Peter had fled, but they found him not far from my house. He admitted to his actions but gave little explanation for his behavior. It was clear he was unstable. The ordeal left me shaken and filled with distrust. I deleted my dating apps and became wary of strangers. But the scariest part of all was knowing how close I had come to real danger. The back door, I later learned, was nearly destroyed, barely held together by the latch. If the police had arrived just a few minutes later, Peter would have gotten inside. Who knows what might have happened then? During my gap year between high school and college, I worked the closing shift at a local grocery store. My job as a cashier meant interacting with customers all day, which I didn't mind too much, as I was naturally shy and it helped me come out of my shell. After 7 o'clock, though, the store would quiet down. There were only a handful of customers each hour, and by the last stretch between 9 and 10 p.m., I might see 2 or 3 at most. After my shift ended, I had a routine. I'd refill the bags, clean the counters, and ensure everything was ready for the morning crew. By the time I clocked out at 10:15 p.m., the store would be nearly empty. The lead cashier, who had to stay behind to count the registers, always left after me, which meant I walked out into the dark parking lot alone every night. One night, after a seemingly uneventful shift, I grabbed my things, clocked out, and headed to my car. The parking lot was dimly lit, and aside from the few cars belonging to co-workers still in the store, it was almost deserted. As I approached my car, I noticed a vehicle parked right next to mine with its headlights on. I couldn't see who was inside because the glare made it impossible, but something about the situation felt odd. I quickly got into my car, trying not to appear startled. Out of instinct, I glanced over, and to my shock, the man in the car was staring directly at me. His gaze was intense, unblinking, and it sent a chill down my spine. I looked away immediately, hoping not to provoke him, and started my car. The moment I pulled out of my spot, the man's car started too. He didn't follow me though. Instead, he turned off into another area of the lot. The next day at work, I mentioned the encounter to one of my managers. I joked about it, asking if we'd hired someone new for the night shift. They assured me we hadn't and dismissed the incident as a weird coincidence. We laughed it off, but deep down, I couldn't shake the unease I felt. 2 days later, I worked the closing shift again. Everything seemed normal at first. The store was quiet, and I hadn't seen anything unusual until about 8 p.m. That's when I noticed a man wandering aimlessly through the aisles. He wasn't carrying anything, no cart, no basket, just walking slowly. His presence felt off, like he didn't belong there. Then I realized why. It was him, the man from the parking lot. I tried to keep calm, watching him from the corner of my eye as he moved around. Occasionally, I caught him glancing in my direction. His gaze wasn't casual. It felt deliberate and piercing. I looked away, hoping he'd lose interest, but he didn't. At one point, he stood in an aisle directly across from my register, pretending to look at items on the shelves. But his head was turned slightly, his eyes locked on me. I felt my stomach tighten. Why was he here? What did he want? My instinct screamed at me to leave, but I had to finish my shift. By 9:30, he was gone, or so I thought. I didn't see him leave, but I convinced myself he must have slipped out unnoticed. I closed up the register, restocked the bags, and asked the lead cashier if they needed anything before I left. They waved me off, and I headed to the parking lot, relieved to finally go home. The lot was mostly empty, and I was relieved to see no cars parked near mine. I started walking toward my car when, suddenly, blinding headlights lit up the space in front of me. A car's engine roared to life, and it began speeding toward me. Panic gripped me as the vehicle slowed abruptly, stopping right in front of me. The man from the store got out. He moved quickly, his steps purposeful, as he made a beeline for me. I sprinted the remaining distance to my car, fumbling with my keys as adrenaline coursed through me. I barely managed to unlock the door and slam it shut before he reached me. I watched in horror as he grabbed the handle, yanking it forcefully. When it didn't budge, he ran to the back door, trying it too. His face was wild, his movements frantic. My hands shook uncontrollably as I fumbled to start the car. Finally, the engine roared to life, and the man froze for a moment. Then, without warning, he ran back to his own car, got in, and sped off. I sat in my car, shaking, trying to process what had just happened. My heart was pounding so hard it hurt. I managed to call the police, though my voice trembled so much that it was hard to explain what had happened. When they arrived, I gave them a description of the man and his car. Unfortunately, the security cameras in the lot were old and blurry, unable to capture his face or license plate. The case went cold. For weeks after, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Every time I left work, I scanned the parking lot, expecting to see him. Eventually, I quit my job, unable to bear the constant fear. I never saw the man again, but the memory of his stare and the sound of his hands pulling at my car door still haunt me. Even now, years later, I feel a rush of fear every time I find myself alone in a dark parking lot.